plundering dwarven holds, hordes of enemies coming at you in waves while your torchlight slowly dies and you are consumed by the darkness, with the only comfort that you have being your weapons grade ale. Yeah, I dig this. Hey friends, today we are talking about a game coming to Kickstarter right soon, but made by a couple of people in our community that I really do believe in and support. The game is Torch and Shield, an incredibly cool miniatures game that is quite frankly everything I wanted Warcry to be when it came out. Torch and Shield is a dungeon-delving skirmish game that sees various dwarven clans going into the long-abandoned depths of their ancestral holds to plunder wealth, weapons, technology, and forbidden lore from ages past. You play as the leader of one such expedition, and while you are down exploring the depths of a long-forgotten hold, you'll be on the lookout for treasure, trying to fight off monsters, and other dwarves that happen to be as entrepreneurial as you. Torch and Shield is going live on Kickstarter today, and so that's why we're talking about it, and throughout the rest of this week here on 2+ Stuff. The guys over at Grimskull were kind enough to send me a kind of an early review copy, so there's a little bit of cleaning up that happens between this and the edition that you will receive, but we're going to be going through the rules today, talking about what makes the game unique, why do I say it's everything I wanted from Warcry, what is it about Torch and Shield that makes me, quite frankly, in 2015 want to run this at Adepticon. And so that's what this episode's going to be about, talking the high-level mechanics of the game, things that make it interesting for people who have already been into miniatures games, and kind of having a discussion about how inviting it is for people who have not. Before we go too far in, let's talk about value. Now, to get just the printed copy of this and like everything you need to start playing, the game is models agnostic. You can use anything you want. So this is really what you need. I think to have it shipped, it's printed in Australia and then shipped worldwide. I think it's $45 US. Which, for the entire game system campaign thing we're going to talk about, just keep that in mind. It's a good number. And they do also have a huge range of miniatures, like if you want to get the bigger campaign options, those are probably great values for people who don't have a ton of miniatures. They sent me a bunch, and I thought about painting them, like for, you know, the videos and that kind of stuff, for this video really. But actually I wanted to paint them live with folks. The demoing that I did was with my other miniatures that I have around the house. So if you're watching this at the time it comes out, go look at any of our live shows or my live streams. I'll be painting up some Torch and Shield minis. But now let's get to the basics of the game. Both players will assemble a crew of dwarves, usually about 5 to 7 miniatures. Of course, as I said before, they have miniatures for sale, but it's designed to be miniatures agnostic. So if you have dwarves or have been looking to get some specific ones, or you don't care about dwarves at all and you just want to kind of overlay your own lore on top of this game framework, it is completely open to do that. Now, if you go onto Kickstarter, you'll see the core game comes with that booklet that I showed you, as well as a PDF for a bunch of tiles. And you can use these to make your own game board, but note, however, the instructions are, again, open enough for you to use anything. Even in the scenario descriptions, it doesn't say like exact quadrants, it gives you kind of vague ideas. There should be a north entrance and a south entrance. No matter what, whether you use the tiles or not, you're going to be designing your own board, which is wonderful because it never has to be the same way twice. But to be honest, I mean, you could probably spend $12 at Michael's and make your own custom board. In fact, I might do that just to prove it. When I say your own custom board, I mean infinite boards, basically. Now, another thing to point out, this is a PvP versus E game. What I mean by that is you are facing your opponent, but in the middle of that, the AI, quote unquote, activates and the monsters of the board spawn, come to life, and try to attack you. So yes, you're always trying to fight your opponent, and you're trying to race them to the finish line, of course, but they're not always going to be what you're fighting. The enemies, just for your own purposes with models and that kind of stuff to represent them, are split into 4 broad categories rather than specific beasts. The categories here are swarms, which are your little tiny gribblies that they have like an insect model to represent those. Your broods, which are going to be sort of like goblin-esque creatures, right? A little bit bigger than, say, a biting insect or a rat, something like that. Large minions would be something like an orc, you know, a big muscly thing. And then, of course, you have your big boss, which that's just what I call it. It's a big epic miniature. They have a minotaur one and a giant lizard. There's all different kinds of ways to configure these to make them really interesting. Now, one of the unique mechanics of this game that I simply cannot not talk about is the way that it uses light. The story that is being played out, whether or not you use the actual, dwarven background and stuff like that, is you're going into the darkest underground caverns depths of dwarven holds, regardless of what faction you play. So light is its own precious resource at those depths. You have a mission length that the scenario will dictate, so say it goes for 6 turns. At the start of the game, you're going to roll a die. That is how many turns you have torches for. So the game goes on for a certain length, but at some point your torch will go out. When darkness falls upon you, all the enemies become much stronger. And what I love about that is from the moment the game starts, the clock is ticking. Nobody gets to do take and hold. We're all trying to mad dash through this maze to get to the same objective, while smashing aside enemies. One other thing that's very important, it's kind of ancillary to light, although it's not hyper relevant. Pushing is a big thing. Every time there's a fight or whatever, enemies will be pushed back an inch or pulled forward an inch in the case of enemies trying to claw you into the darkness. But movement, I guess, in combat and resolution of things is a big factor, which means your light source can be moved out of sequence than you want it to, which means you can pull people's light away from their warriors. And to that end, equipping your warband with items that aren't initially very exciting, like lanterns and hand torches, like the actual flame ones, it becomes very interesting. I don't know if any of you guys ever played More Time back in the day. I played a few games of it because there were a few folks at an early game store that played it after it was discontinued. But one of the things they had mentioned to me was there's just some items that you're never going to take, right? There's a whole roster of things, and there's maybe 8 good ones depending on the build of your character, in terms of just the sheer roster of items that are available to you. And some of the ones that are very often overlooked are the more mundane things, right? We like the esoteric weapons, but when light plays a factor into the core mechanics of your game system, those little things matter a lot. And it makes them very interesting items because with a lantern, for example, you can carry it. Say your guy has a lantern and a rifle, he can put the lantern down, fire with the rifle, pick the lantern up, and keep going. But if anything interrupts that sequence, like say he puts the lantern down and then he gets attacked and shoved away from it, he lost the lantern. You start by building a map like one you see in the mission sections. And the mission, like I said before, will also have the full game length. Separately, you roll to see how much fuel you have. And when that burns out, like I said, things get harder. Now there's a mix of mission types, things from take and hold an objective, assassinate, kind of a king of the hill, I guess is probably another way to say some of those. All of your fighters have a big stat line to them. Everybody has a movement stat, and there's a bunch of other stats that let you do cool actions. The way that you make tests in the game is very similar to Hero Quest, if you ever played that one, where let's say you have a stat of 5 for fighting, right? We're going to say you're fighting a monster. You're going to roll 5 dice. Any 5s or 6s are going to be successes. Any 1s are fails, and if you have more 1s than successes, something bad happens. We'll get to that in just a second here. The phases of the game, as I described them before, you have the delving phase, which is you and your opponent moving. You have the monster phase, which is when the environment goes. This could be spawning new monsters, moving the ones that are on the board, and so on. Then you have the fight phase, which is exactly as it sounds. One cool thing that I like about this combat system is that it keeps things very simple. So let's say my dwarf is fighting the opponent's dwarf, and then a monster comes. Immediately, as a statement of honor, us 2 dwarves are going to disengage, and whoever's closer to the monster is going to fight them. So you don't really worry about these kind of 3 opponent encounters where it's you, your opponent, and the AI. Instead, it's like, oh, well, I'm not going to steal your honor. I'm not here to do that. I'm just here to get some treasure. So yeah, you go ahead and kill the beast. I'm going to keep running towards the goal. I was like, man, what a simple way to resolve that. Because that was always the thing that really got me with the Elder Scrolls AI, is it just felt very clunky if you got bogged down. And whereas this is like, no, I'm just gonna go get the goal. Now to start playing Torch and Shield at the delving phase, you're going to need a bunch of D6s and a standard deck of playing cards, which is something I forgot to mention earlier. This uses both of those. The cards are more for your initiative order and special actions, and the dice are to resolve tests. There's not really any crossover, so it's very simple. So how do the cards work? Well, at the top of the round, you're going to deal yourself a number of cards plus 1, where the X is the number of dwarves you have on the table. So if you have 5 dwarves on the table, you're going to draw 6 cards, 5 dwarves plus 1. Next, you're going to put those cards into order from aces high to aces low. So aces, kings, queens, jacks, and then numerically 10 down. Aces can be either highs or lows, so you get a little wiggle room there. Jokers can be anything. Players then start at the top, aces high. Hey, do I have an ace? Do you have an ace? Neither of us do? Okay, then we go to the next one down. And this is the way that it essentially does initiative order. The higher the number slash suite, so jack compared to a 10, the jack's always going to be able to activate first. So that's how the cards are used to determine initiative order. When it comes down to your number, do you have, for example, a 9? Yeah, I got one. Just say it to your opponent. And now you have to activate a model. You can activate any of the models on the table that are yours, of course. And when you put that 9 down, I mean to discard it and activate your model, you have a choice to make. You can either make any of the basic actions, which are things like, you'd expect move, fight, craft, throw, interact with object, that kind of stuff. Or you could do a special action depending on what kind of card it is. You see, not only does the number of card reflect the initiative order, but also its suite unlocks special actions. So for example, let's go through this together. Let's say we're just getting to the 9s as we're counting down from aces high. I have a 9 of diamonds. It means I need to activate someone in my crew at this point, and when I do, they can either use any of the basic actions that are in the core game, or because it is a diamond, they gain access to rush and barge, which are essentially special actions that let you move at double speed or, tackle into an enemy and move them towards something else. So now this puts you in a really good thinking spot. You have to think about, well, what models do I want to activate first and last, of course, but also, are there any of my miniatures on the table right now that would benefit from having a particular suite of card to get that special action? And all those things have to factor into your decision making. But what's nice about this is that you're doing it at the same time as your opponent, right? Once those cards are drawn, just take 3 minutes to look at the board and think about your turn, and you're both doing that. And that's what I love about this. I've said it about Conquest as well. When you can offload some of that analysis paralysis, so you're not waiting for each other, you're doing it at the same time, it makes the actual turn, when you're in the meat of it, a lot more interesting. One last little thing here for those of us who played Wartime back in the day, and this was a big, I'm going to call it a quality of life change, and that is when you end a movement, if you are within range of something that you can interact with, you get to do it for free. So let's say the mission was to get across the entire hold and pull a lever, right, to elevator to go up to the top. If you end your movement dead next to that lever, you can pull it for free. Now that doesn't sound like much for anyone now, but in Wartime, if you're like me and you got to that last little movement and you didn't have the action points to pull the lever and you had to wait a whole new turn and round of activations, it's infuriating. Now I mentioned before the way the dice pool works is if you want to do an action, or a test rather, you just take that number of dice to the relevant skill and roll them. 5s and 6s are good, 1s are bad. If you have more 1s than 5s or 6s, something really bad happens to you. An example of that in context would be lighting a brazier, okay? There's a lot of these little terrain things where it's a solid point of light that won't necessarily go out anytime soon. You want to light the brazier. You're going to roll your crafting skill, I think it is, and let's say you have more 1s than 5s or 6s, the brazier puts you on fire, or there's some catastrophic accident regarding it. And really, that's it for the core mechanics. I mean, I think I've pretty much outlined the basic fundamentals, but let's talk about why it's interesting and why it won't get stale. First off is just the simple fact that you can use whatever miniatures you want. So you can use Torch and Shield's system to do exactly what they want you to do. Dwarf on dwarf combat in a dark hold. You could also have this be dwarves fighting goblins through the Gloomspite Gitz hold, which I think probably does a better job of representing that than Warcry. But, you can do quite a few things like that. You could have no dwarves involved at all. Really, the only thing that you can't, lore-wise get yourself out of, really, is just, it's all about light. You gotta stay towards the light. You could put Star Wars miniatures on the table and it would make perfect sense, provided somebody had a flashlight. But let's say you're getting this because you want to stick to the Grimskald stuff, which I definitely do approve of. What is in here for you? Well, there's a mountain of content here to get you started for sure. 3 dwarven clans with more on the way, and each of them has their own buffs, bonuses, motivations, things that make them unique, which again, if you want to use anything that's non-dwarven, you just pick one of the 3 archetypes basically, and there you go. There's a whole section of different missions, a campaign section so you can keep your story going, and not to mention the number of things that are randomly generated, like the effects, the map, all that kind of stuff. You kind of have an infinite amount of gameplay here. It is a lightweight system, so as long as you are creating the characters in advance, you can bring this to a game night and people will get it very quickly. But here's the thing, right? I can extol the virtues of a rules light system, but my criticism with games like Warcry has been that they are so light that there's not enough stats and values to meaningfully articulate things. So for example, I gave that example before of rolling too many ones to light a brazier. The brazier catches the dude on fire, now your dwarf's on fire. Let's say your dwarf runs randomly towards the nearest water source and he jumps in. Now your dwarf is soaked. He can no longer carry torches or lanterns or any kind of light source. So like, this evolving narrative happens very naturally, and all of those things are their own steps and sequences, but not any one of them is complicated at all. And you flow through the sequence of events in the book very seamlessly. And that's one thing that's kind of hard to articulate in this. It's just well written. So that whole sequence of having to, roll for the torch, what are the consequences of it? Can he make it to the water? Resolving that, it was all just very natural and simple. And there's consequences. My dude was on fire. He got hurt. Now he's soaked and he can't be the bearer of light anymore. Stuff like your opponent coming up next to you and you shove them into the dark to let the monsters pull them further into their reaches and their grasp while you run towards the exit. It's a minor act of betrayal played out in real time, and it's just fun. And so let's move into the final thoughts on the game and at its price point, talking about overall value. Like I said before, the basic print copy like this goes for $45 US. I think it's like 69 in Australian dollars. For that, you get the book, the PDF for the tiles, which are great. They're just very simple. You want to keep it simple for these, as well as the PDF for tokens. You can actually get a complete digital copy of everything for much less. I think it's closer to 25 bucks or something. So if you're looking for a budget game, that's a great way to go. Now, if you're someone who, say, plays Fire Slayers or Carriage and Overlords or something like that, you already have dwarf models from whatever game system. If you already own any terrain, this is an entire game system for 45 bucks. It's the perfect bait game to get new players into the hobby because it's so accessible. And it's also a great gift because it's just not cumbersome, right? You can give this to someone who loves dwarf models and will make them very excited. It's dripping with all kinds of lore. There's a whole thing on what happened to the elves, and basically how does that history factor into what happened to the initial dwarves that now their holds are empty. It's fun. Now, with that are a ton of STL files that you can get as well. There's all different kinds of tiers. I don't have a 3D printer, so those don't really appeal to me. But I'm going to be throwing up some shots of these miniatures here so you can get a good look at them. And the last thing I really want to harp on here is I've already talked about the game's accessibility. This game comes with some pre-made warbands for you. It requires no thinking. Out of the box, from the minute you get this in the mail, you can be playing within 20 minutes. And that's important because a lot of these games where you have the ability to create your own warband, you're picking a fighter and then you have to equip them, it can be very daunting and cumbersome. They give you some great options to start off with, like solid warbands. I played 3 rounds of me versus the environment just to get a sense of the tests and that kind of thing. And the equipment loadouts that they came in, the pre-generated characters, are great. Because there's that good mix of light sources, guns, and a bigger emphasis on melee combat, which kind of goes for the entire game. So it could be as simple as picking it up and just playing the warbands that come designed with it, or you could be as granular as you want and make your own super cool warband that's kit bashed to the nines and has all different skills and abilities and various kinds of ails. It's awesome, and it's absolutely the kind of game that I want to cover here on the channel. So Grimskull Games, thank you guys so much for sending me a copy. It's really cool. I hope your Kickstarter goes exceptionally well. Please consider checking out Torch and Shield over on Kickstarter if you liked anything that you saw here. Go help out and support these indie game designers because, quite frankly, it's just great stuff. You can't find passion in game design like this anywhere else. Thank you all so much for watching and hearing me out. I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.